Hello and welcome to the Career Compass program, which includes online learning sessions, podcasts, videos, webinars, white papers, and whiteboard videos, all specifically designed for NAVFAC. Please check the Career Compass Resource Center or CCRC often for updates and new content to support your learning. This content will assist with learning and development within the 20 non-technical competencies outlined in the Workforce Development Strategy. Today's topic is conflict management, managing team conflict in support of the conflict management competency. Throughout this video, you will see a paper-pencil icon on some slides, indicating a workbook activity. When you see this icon on the top left corner, this means I'll be asking you to write something in your workbook or refer to your workbook. If possible, download the workbook from the Career Compass Resource Center or CCRC before continuing with this course. However, if you are not able to, just use any piece of paper and write your thoughts down on that. You can always transfer that to the workbook later. Today, you will learn the role of leaders in recognizing destructive conflict and determining whether and when to intervene. You'll understand the common causes and triggers of conflict and how people typically approach conflict, and finally, we hope you will be able to determine how to use coaching and mediation to diffuse conflict before it becomes harmful and destructive. So what is conflict management? Conflict management is about avoiding or resolving destructive disagreements before they can damage people, relationships, the team, or the organization. But it is important to acknowledge right up front that we are talking about destructive conflict, not all conflict. So let's start with a question for you. When could workplace conflict be healthy? Pause the video and write in your workbook some healthy examples of conflict in the workplace. Resume the video when you are ready. In the live session conducted for this topic, some of the responses that participants gave included brainstorming and group problem solving. Conflicts are everyday occurrences. They are an essential part of human relations at home and at work. Without conflict, people would always agree with each other. This might sound nice, but very little change or innovation would occur. Constructive conflict often leads to better ways of doing things. Destructive conflict, on the other hand, must be resolved. Otherwise, it can divide family, friends, and coworkers, leading to dysfunction and enormous stress. Accept conflicts as a natural part of life, but learn to deal with them effectively and efficiently to promote constructive conflict and avoid or quickly resolve destructive conflict. Leaders are busy, and conflict in organizations is natural, even desirable in many cases. So why should leaders spend time managing it? Consider first that the average American worker spends 2.8 hours per week embroiled in negative conflict. For the average NAVFAC worker, that amounts to about $10,000 per year in lost productivity. Conflict sometimes stems from seemingly insignificant factors, but if participants in a conflict don't address small issues, the disagreement can become much more serious. Beyond the financial impact, it can lead to increased stress, disruptions in work, health issues, absenteeism, and even turnover. When you take the time to resolve destructive conflict, worker health and resiliency improves because reducing anger and stress protects against anxiety and heart disease. It improves quality of sleep, which boosts the immune system, cognitive function, and performance at work. Positive reciprocity also accrues because people rebuild trust, which creates goodwill, and people on your team will work together more. Reduced harmful conflict leads very quickly to better relationships and more positivity at work, which means more collaboration, idea sharing, and productivity. Each of these things improves employee engagement. So don't ignore destructive conflict between coworkers or within and between groups. Aside from all of the negative consequences listed here, you won't succeed in avoiding it anyway. Conflict avoidance only creates larger problems down the road. Now that we understand why managing conflict is important, let's talk about the common sources of conflict within teams. Understanding these common sources of conflict and what often triggers conflict can help you recognize these things early, so that where appropriate, you can intervene. Probably the most common and perhaps most challenging form of conflict you will encounter as a manager is between individuals on your team. This is called interpersonal and is between two people. Intergroup conflict is when two members of a team conflict and the conflict spreads to other members of the team. Finally, a more infrequent form of workplace conflict is intragroup, where teams come in conflict with each other. For example, your team gets into a dispute with another leader's team over a shared resource, interdependency, or something else. It is normal for some tension to arise between people and teams as they balance and cope with their interdependencies, manage personality differences, or compete for recognition, promotions, or even just resources. However, when coworkers and teams enter into open conflict, the resulting lack of cooperation can result in severe consequences for the organization. As a leader, you should assess conflict closely. Be mindful of the catalysts and causes of potentially harmful conflict. There are too many to discuss today, but let's talk about some of the most common root causes, many of which are at least partially within your control as a leader. Most conflict is, at its roots, emotional, whether over trust, feeling disrespected, or feeling unheard and excluded. Other major drivers of conflict are misunderstandings and biases. People often cause conflict when they lack an understanding of others' expectations but act anyway. As a leader, you may create the conditions for conflict if you don't communicate your expectations clearly. If your performance measures that lead to promotions and salary increases, etc., aren't fair and transparent, you can expect every type of conflict, from interpersonal to intergroup and between groups. Even the way you're organized, your processes and rules can cause conflict if they are poorly structured or instituted, underexplained, or applied inconsistently. First, though, consider the work environment carefully. As the renowned business coach and author Marshall Goldsmith points out, the environment we find ourselves in can often trigger bad behaviors in otherwise reasonable people. Goldsmith writes, "When we experience road rage on a crowded freeway, it's not because we are sociopathic monsters. It's because the temporary condition of being behind the wheel in a car, surrounded by rude, impatient drivers, triggers a change in our otherwise placid demeanor. We've unwittingly placed ourselves in an environment of impatience, competitiveness, and hostility, and it alters us." This quote is from Goldsmith's bestseller, Triggers, in which he argues that the environments we find ourselves in or put ourselves in can trigger bad behavior or poor choices. A healthy and positive work environment is critical to avoiding or reducing conflict. Goldsmith also reminds us that our resistance depletes as the day wears on. In other words, by late afternoon, you and your team may have less in your reserves to maintain control or to resist the type of language, reactions, and behaviors that lead to conflict. Let's think about that for a minute. Please take a look at the chart on the slide, which comes from the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It tracks the decisions made by parole board judges throughout a typical day. The horizontal axis tracks hours from early morning to early evening. The vertical axis tracks the likelihood of a favorable decision where the judges grant parole. The dotted lines represent breaks taken by the judges throughout the day. What do you think this data tells us about decision-making and agreeableness relative to time of day? Pause the video for a moment and think about this. Write your thoughts in the workbook and resume the video when you are ready. Observations of parole boards have revealed that 70% of cases heard in the morning meet with approval, versus only 10% of those decided late in the day. And no matter what time of day, after judges take breaks, favorable decisions increase, declining again as the day wears on. People have only so much capacity for focus, and they deplete that energy throughout the day. Encourage people to take regular breaks and lunches so they can recharge. This places people in a better mindset and with more reserves with which to manage disagreements respectfully and constructively. Before we move into strategies and techniques for resolving destructive conflict, let's take one last look at how you, as a leader, can set certain conditions that reduce the likelihood of destructive conflict. First, create open communication channels and develop trusting relationships with your team members to prevent unnecessary conflicts. Meet with them one-on-one, at least monthly, to talk about their goals, their progress against professional development and career plans, their needs, and any potential conflict that could be brewing. Foster trust between coworkers as well by building direct lines of communication between them and by creating a culture of openness, transparency, autonomy, and accountability. Your colleagues will be more likely to trust each other if they have clear goals, understand each other's roles, and learn to count on each other to deliver as promised, and to share knowledge and collaborate. As a leader, set the example. Share your thoughts on relevant issues, ask thoughtful questions that show people you value their input, practice transparency, and encourage it throughout your teams. For example, be transparent about any challenges the team or organization is facing. Build trust by demonstrating reliability. Encourage colleagues to share and keep abreast of one another's work and achievements. Reward and recognize team members for their positive behaviors as well as their outcomes. Create shared values and a culture that emphasizes integrity and shuns corrosive behaviors like talking behind each other's backs. Demonstrate your own integrity with positive actions, such as admitting mistakes when you're wrong. Remember, too, that trust is often reciprocal. As a leader, be the first to extend trust and respect. When you do so, your team is likely to extend it in return. Avoid contradicting, questioning, or upstaging colleagues and your team members. Doing so harms your connections with them. Failing to validate your team members or commenting on the things they share with you also triggers resistance to your ideas. Strengthen your connections by choosing your words with care. Be aware of your tone of voice and body language. Clarify your expectations. Failing to set expectations wastes time because you have to ask people to redo tasks. It creates frustration that can lead to conflict. Let team members know exactly what leaders at different levels of your company expect, both explicitly and implicitly, from their work. And make sure that performance measurement systems are equally applied, consistent, and fair. Despite the potential harmful effects of conflict, it is not necessary or even healthy for you to referee every disagreement. Sometimes it's better to let the parties work it out on their own. For example, during a regular team meeting, you might acknowledge an ongoing disagreement you've noticed and simply ask the parties to meet and come to a compromise. But what if you knew that they had tried to do that in the past with no success? What if you knew that emotions were running high, and for an example, an employee was pulling seniority and rank to intimidate another? To determine whether you should intervene, ask yourself these questions. Is their behavior affecting others' ability to do their job? Is performance suffering? Could this conflict negatively affect team productivity, partner relationships, or customers? Could this conflict devolve into something worse, such as abuse, bullying, or otherwise contribute to a toxic work environment? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then you should get involved. As a leader, you can offer those in disagreement a more objective perspective on the situation and help them reach an understanding. Consider and perhaps adapt the basic assessment from Fifth House Group on the slide and use it to gauge the seriousness of disputes so that you can determine the most appropriate intervention. Though simple and written from the disputant's perspective, the 4 factors assessed in the worksheet may help you decide whether intervention is needed. If, for example, the cumulative score exceeds about 7 or 8, intervention of some sort might be appropriate. This could involve coaching the parties. If it hits 14 or more, urgent intervention may be needed, for example, in the form of mediation. Think of a current workplace conflict that you are facing. Now pause the video and assess the situation using the questions in your workbook on page 7 and write down your thoughts on this reflection. Resume the video when you are ready. If your score was high, you may need to mediate. One type of mediation is conflict coaching. As a leader, you are well positioned to coach your team members through conflict. Being a conflict coach simply means meeting with the parties to a conflict separately to talk it through and search for paths to resolution. In conflict coaching, your goal is to help the parties reach resolution themselves. Here are some tips. Not all conflict should be suppressed. Healthy and respectful disagreement is good for any organization that hopes to innovate and remain relevant. But after you're satisfied that the parties to a destructive conflict are not likely to resolve it without intervention, consider conflict coaching to assist your team members by guiding them toward conflict resolution as a neutral third party. Meet with the parties separately. You may have just one of the parties to the conflict to coach, both, or even several. Listen to their perspectives, ask questions, look for the root causes, and ask them how they think the conflict might be resolved. Try to guide each party to their own potential solutions. Offer ideas and ask questions, but don't suggest solutions. Resolving the conflict is not your responsibility. Instead, you should try to assist the process of resolution by helping those involved find acceptable options. This breeds ownership of solutions, making them much more likely to stick than solutions imposed or even suggested by a leader. The process could require more than one coaching session with each of the parties. Note that coaching is often performed in anticipation of bringing the parties together for conflict mediation. Sometimes, coaching alone helps the parties reach resolution on their own. Sometimes, though, it is not enough, but that's okay. Your coaching efforts will almost certainly pay off in mediation. Finally, conflict coaching isn't always aimed at solving an ongoing dispute. Sometimes it can be preventative. A team member might come to you wanting advice on ways to prevent a dispute from unnecessarily escalating, or even just to discuss techniques in avoiding negative conflict. Okay. Time for another question for you. Imagine you're a supervisor. You have a team of 15. Your section of the building has one closed office, a meeting room, and 12 cubicles. There is one thermostat in the main area with the 12 cubicles. The closed office and meeting room have their own thermostats. Your team of 12 is constantly in conflict over the temperature. One turns it down, and a few minutes later another turns it up. A few have taken to working in the meeting room, which causes scheduling problems. No one is happy, and it has begun to impact performance. As the leader, what do you do? Please pause the video and write your thoughts in your workbook on page 8. Resume the video when you are ready. First, this is not a life or death type conflict. It's over a few degrees of room temperature. Even so, referring back to the Fifth House assessment, you would probably score this conflict at least as high as an 8. So as a leader, you need to make a judgment call. When you choose to deal with a conflict can make all the difference. If you address a conflict early in its gestation, you can create more space for a possible resolution. Remain alert to the possibility that disagreements sometimes work themselves out. With that in mind, take care not to blow an argument out of proportion. For this sort of dispute, you might first ask the parties to resolve the problem on their own. The solutions to this issue should be fairly obvious, but if emotions are running high, the parties might be incapable of compromise without intervention. Because there are numerous parties to the conflict, coaching may not be an efficient first step. After all, if you have to meet with multiple parties, potentially several times, resolution may take quite a while and cost you a lot of time, in this case, over a somewhat trivial matter. Instead of coaching, you might schedule a meeting to talk through the issue. Consider limiting the size of the meeting by asking the parties to nominate 1 or 2 people each to represent their side of the conflict. During the meeting, you take on the role of mediator. You're like a referee in the sense that you don't take sides, and fairness to each of the parties is your prime concern. You're also like a referee in that you set the procedural rules and you enforce them. In this case, you officiate a civil discussion. You might start by explaining the rules of the mediation, for example, no disrespectful or accusatory language, no interrupting, respect for talk time, etc., and then invite each side in turn and without interruption to describe their position. By listening actively and asking questions, you may learn that those who prefer colder temperatures have a difficult time concentrating when the temperature is above 70 degrees, for example. The other side might complain about drafts that lead to stiff necks and chills, making work difficult for them too. Next, encourage ideas that might lead to resolution. It's important to elicit these from the parties where possible, but if nothing arises, you can suggest a series of what-ifs, such as, what if the temperature were set at 72 degrees, but desk fans will be purchased for anyone who wants one? What if the temperature were set at 70 degrees, but those who like it cold sat near or under vents and others away from vents? The mediator encourages ideas and sometimes proposes them, but the key is to facilitate constructive negotiation toward a mutually satisfactory resolution. As you may have surmised, conflict coaching and conflict mediation have several things in common. Make conflict mediation voluntary. The parties should agree to mediation, and like coaching, keep it confidential. As a mediator, you never take sides. The most important contribution you make to the process is your neutrality and fairness. The minute you violate that, you lose trust and the confidence of the parties and can no longer be effective. Once you establish trust and confidence, your most important job is to facilitate cooperative, respectful, and constructive discussion and negotiation between the parties to the dispute. A conflict mediator facilitates a discussion with 2 or more parties in a dispute. They are not a champion of one party. The mediator acts to build, maintain, and improve communication between the parties, which in turn produces a willingness to engage in cooperative negotiation. Generally, mediators focus on facilitating negotiations and discussions to assist all parties in identifying their interests and toward resolution of their differences. They help the parties in a conflict come to a mutually acceptable solution, but they avoid providing answers. Mediators might use the 2 truths strategy, where they persuade the parties to acknowledge that either could have correct but differing perspectives, and encourage them to speak favorably of the other's idea even if they disagree. A mediator might employ the impact technique, where when someone suggests a destructive or harmful solution, the mediator asks questions to help that person notice the flaws in the idea before inviting them to suggest alternate options. Alternatively, mediators can try the common criteria approach, where they ask everyone to share what they feel are the key components of a good solution. The mediator should take careful note of what each of the parties says and then point out any alignment toward shared goals. As a conflict mediator, set clear rules against attacking others or using abusive language. As we discussed with the Marshall Goldsmith example and Kahneman's parole board judges, try to schedule coaching sessions and mediations in the morning, when most people still maintain energy, or perhaps right after lunch. For mediations, use neutral settings where possible, such as in a meeting room elsewhere in the building as opposed to the one you use every day. Environments that remind people of the conflict might trigger memories that prove less conducive to effective discussions. In mediation, watch for trigger words or phrases, or even body language that conveys disrespect. If possible, prevent the parties from using the word you at all. Instead, they should say I or we to avoid blaming the other party or making it personal. Don't allow old disputes or issues into the conversation. Focus on the issue or conflict at hand. When the parties introduce past grievances, the discussion can quickly devolve into a series of back-and-forth accusations. Be alert for powerful triggers, such as if one party is dominating the conversation, excluding the other. If a party begins referring subtly or otherwise to their superior rank or status in the organization, this can also be a trigger. Don't allow the parties to call each other's honesty into question. Instead, ask each to support their statements with evidence and facts. Okay, time for another short thought exercise. Imagine again that you're the manager of a team. In order to complete a special project successfully, it is essential that two of your most senior and skilled team members collaborate closely, share knowledge, and align their efforts. Each was on the team before you joined as a manager. Unfortunately, they have never gotten along. However, both are exceptional performers with unique skill sets needed for the project. Even just imagining these two working side by side, sharing ideas, and integrating their work to achieve a goal may feel impossible. But the need is vital and urgent, so you must intervene. As the leader, what do you do? Coach? Mediate? Both? Please pause the video and write your thoughts on page 10. Resume the video when you are ready. There isn't one right answer here, but in the live instances of this webinar, most participants responded that they would start with coaching and would consider mediation if that didn't work. Remember, the origins of interpersonal conflict are often rooted in emotions and misunderstandings. Your team members were already in conflict before you joined. In real life, you might have coached each of them to resolution before the time came that they had to work closely together. But for the sake of illustration, let's assume you didn't, or that you only took the job as manager a week ago. In this case, you would probably start now with conflict coaching, perhaps accelerated conflict coaching due to the urgency. You'll sit with each of the parties separately and listen to their perspectives on the problem, then coach them toward a posture of reconciliation that you can leverage in mediation should that become necessary. Perhaps you'll learn that 3 years ago, one of the parties misinterpreted an action on the part of the other as dismissive and disrespectful. Maybe the offending party was not even aware of the slight, but in turn misinterpreted the other's subsequent behavior as hostile. It's beginning to sound like a sitcom, but this type of thing happens all the time and can make relationships dysfunctional. Whatever the root cause, understanding it leads to more successful coaching and then mediation. In this case, due to the urgency and the importance of repairing the relationship, you may need both. To deal effectively with conflict, you must become comfortable with it and confident in your ability to manage it. Again, if as a leader you avoid or ignore conflict within your team, you might permit a dangerous situation to arise. We've already discussed the importance of timing and setup for coaching and mediation to gain resolution. Choose a time and place conducive to ideation and congenial discussion. Next, as coach or mediator, put the party or parties at ease. Explain your neutral role and your goal to get a mutually agreeable resolution. Not so much a compromise, but a win-win. Start by reiterating any common ground you've discovered and/or where ultimate goals align, even if the parties still disagree on how to get there. Encourage people to discuss their emotions and feelings. Don't suppress them. When people bottle up their feelings, they become resentful, the issues don't get resolved, and you can have teammates who barely speak to each other and who don't work well together. Your next most important role is listener. Hopefully, you've set the environment to exclude distractions such as phones or computers. Hang a Do Not Disturb sign on the door and clear your calendar for the time you've scheduled. Listen intently so that you understand both sides of the dispute and then look for common ground. Share your observations with the parties and ask questions designed to elicit clarity. In mediation, set the ground rules. We've covered those, but respect sums it up. All parties must respect the others, listen intently, and not interrupt. Everyone gets roughly equal time to make their case, describe their needs, and suggest solutions. If you set the ground rules against accusations and blaming, and using I instead of you, allowing each other to speak, etc., you'll most likely find that when people describe their feelings, the other party is surprised. They probably feel the same way too. This often moves a competitive or combative discussion into something more cooperative. Point out the parties' shared interests and what's in it for them to resolve the conflict. These include things like reducing the pain and stress of conflict, the pleasure they'll feel from a satisfactory resolution, and perhaps better relationships, the positive impact on their performance and productivity, and the personal power they gain from shedding an adversary or even just removing the weight of an ongoing dispute. Encourage the parties to keep an open mind to alternatives and that cooperating on small positions might lead to a win-win resolution. Throw out your own what-ifs to move the parties toward agreement. But even better, get them to propose their own ideas. When discussions turn cooperative, the parties start working together toward solving the problem. They seek common ground and move closer to constructive resolution. You will probably never succeed in preventing all destructive conflict. When your measures to prevent it fail, you have no choice but to take action to address it as early in the conflict as possible, whether by asking the parties to resolve it themselves, coaching the participants, offering mediation, or a combination of two or even all three. Consider these 7 practices or approaches when working to diffuse conflict. First, acknowledge the conflict. If you do not accept that a dispute exists, you risk letting it spiral out of control. If, as a leader, you find yourself worrying about the situation at night, it's probably time to acknowledge it. That doesn't mean you have to try to resolve the situation immediately, but you should accept the conflict as a potential problem. This lets you see things more clearly so you can start to deal with it. Second, properly plan your intervention. Once you've decided to intervene, think through how you'll respond. Think clearly about what confronts you, evaluate your position, and decide how to act. This might include coaching or asking the parties to join a mediation. Third, get your facts straight. Prepare yourself with correct information so you do not err when you enter into a conversation, whether coaching, mediation, or otherwise. Fourth, identify and think through outcomes and options. Even though the parties to the conflict should arrive at their own resolution, as coach, mediator, or otherwise, you should think through the various ways the conflict might be resolved. Fifth, consider reframing the conflict. Sometimes it helps when a neutral party presents the situation using a new perspective. Your own values might influence how you reframe, but the purpose is to get the parties thinking about ways to break their logjam, not to find the answers on your own. Watch their body language and whether they seem uncomfortable about certain subjects. Give them time to reveal whatever is on their minds. Sixth, manage the resolution. In situations where the conflicting sides have not reached agreement even after coaching and mediation, consider taking on a more active role as a resolution agent. A resolution agent undertakes many of the same activities as a conflict coach or a mediator. But unlike those roles, they offer ideas and potential solutions rather than relying on advice and guidance. Remember, though, the resolution agent still needs to construct an environment in which the opposing sides can trust each other and you as the resolution agent. Finally, engage the safety net. You may encounter situations where coaching, mediation, or other forms of conflict resolution don't work or seem inappropriate. Evaluate your options before you act. Check with in-house counsel about alternatives and/or consult with subject matter experts. In summary, conflict coaching and mediation are relatively new terms for something effective leaders have been doing informally for a very long time, helping their teams through disagreements. Conflict in teams and groups is inevitable, but leaders can take steps to avoid much of it or diffuse it before it reaches the stage where coaching and mediation are necessary. Leaders should use conflict coaching to reduce disputes, prevent them from escalating, and to prepare parties for conflict mediation. Look for the root causes of conflicts and assess them before jumping to conflict mediation as the answer. Sometimes the disputants can and should work it out on their own. In mediation, use proven techniques to guide the parties to mutually satisfactory resolutions. If coaching and mediation fail, consider managing the resolution more directly by suggesting your own solutions. Sometimes, you can't reach resolution despite your best efforts. In those cases, ask for help. That could range from counseling assistance for a party to a conflict or coaching of your own from a more experienced leader. You might also face situations where you feel the problem has escalated beyond your capabilities and/or the consequences are so serious that you need to consult with the legal team, senior executives, or both. Err on the side of caution in these cases. Seek help. Lastly, while you may not be a licensed counselor or may not have a coaching certificate, nevertheless, by applying the principles and techniques in this course, you can probably manage the vast majority of conflict among your teams. We've covered a lot today, including recognizing constructive and destructive conflict and the approaches to reducing destructive conflict in your teams. As we wrap up, after completing this video, in your workbook on page 11, please write down your thoughts on this reflection. How can you apply these conflict management techniques at your workplace? And what is the most important tip you will share with a coworker who hasn't attended this webinar? Thank you for attending today and for your active participation in this course. We hope that you gleaned useful and helpful information. If you have questions that were not addressed here, please contact your local BD17 representative or contact HQ's BD17 at NAVFAC-HQ, Total Force Development at Navy.mil. You will receive credit for participating in this course. To receive credit, email the address here with the listed subject line, course name, and completion code, or scan the QR code on your screen. This will automatically generate the email you need to send. Just be sure to include your Navy email address in the body of your email if you're using a personal device. Thank you, and have a great day.